Once again, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as we would like to start our next panel discussion, once again, we would like to invite all participants, you may please return to ballroom and kindly have a seat. Thank you. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the OECD IOPS OJK Global Forum on Private Pensions 2024 Improving Retirement Outcomes Global Perspective this afternoon. May I hear a big round of applause to start our next panel discussion? I know after the lunch break there'll always be a critical time, but I believe each and every one of you are ready to continuing our next panel discussion and already recharge your energy. I do hope you enjoy your lunch experience presented by the Padma Legian Hotel. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we will continue our next panel discussion that will talk about the role of pension funds in the transition towards sustainable finance. And to begin the session, I would like to introduce to you our moderator. Please welcome on stage CEO Pensions Authority Ireland and Chair of the IOPS Technical Committee. Please welcome Mr. Brendan Kennedy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch as much as I enjoyed mine. This topic, the role of pension funds in the transition to sustainable finance. It's a topic that, you know, there are significant differences of opinion. It's a very complicated topic, and it's an urgent topic. So I think this panel discussion is going to help us all. Could I invite the four panelists to come join me on the stage, please? And I'd like to congratulate the organisers of this session, because we have a really good range of speakers. If I could describe it as a research person, a regulator person, a policy person, and a pensions and insurance industry person. So if there are any gaps left over from those four, you can fill them from your own contributions from the floor. So I'm going to go straight into the presentations, and first up, Mike.
Hello, everyone. It's really impressive that so many people are still at the conference. It's a testimony to the organization and the sessions and how good they've been. It's a pleasure to be here in Indonesia and have a chance to talk about this topic. When we planned this session, we realized we all had diverse backgrounds, and we're each going to focus on a different area. I'm going to focus on what the academic research literature says. Fiona's from the World Bank, and she'll have a chance to talk about other perspectives. I think there are 5 key questions of interest to regulators. Do pension funds gain returns by investing sustainably? Lose them? So that's the investment returns higher. Does sustainable investing really make a difference for society macroeconomically? Is the move to sustainable investing driven by regulation or by fundamentals, people wanting to invest or being forced to? Fourth, are there unintended consequences? Does it introduce market distortions, things that just haven't been anticipated? With the best of intentions, we've seen over a long period of time the pension regulations have led to unintended consequences. Is it the case with sustainable investing? And finally, how will technology matter? So is technology going to make sustainable investing more effective, more efficient? And what I want to do is I only have 10 or so minutes. We want to allow time for discussion. I want to get some thoughts flowing on this issue. These are areas that have a lot of literature, and each of them I can cite studies for and against, and I'm focusing only on the academic literature because we have Elvin, who knows a lot about the industry experience, and Fiona, who knows a lot about what international organizations have done. They're for and against, but my hypothesis is the following, is that when decisions have been based on motivation of fundamental investing, thinking fundamentals, as in Benjamin Graham's fundamental investing, thinking about the intrinsic value, thinking about investing with a margin to protect against errors in judgment, thinking about long-term perspective, long-term value creation rather than short-term market fluctuations, when the focus has been on fundamentals, things tend to work. And when the focus has been on other people saying what's interesting, elites or governments saying, oh, this is a special project, please invest in it, things have not gone well. And that's very important from a regulatory perspective because you need to be able to assess, is it based on fundamentals or is it driven by something outside of what is member interests? So as an example, if a pension fund decides to invest in renewable energy because it's assessed financial metrics, projected cash flows, return on investment and profitability, evaluation of market trends, and done risk analysis, that's fundamentals. On the other hand, if it's under political pressure to support local employment and environmental initiatives, and the pension fund decides to invest in a state-sponsored solar farm without any proper due diligence, and the project has known financial issues, a lack of competitive advantage, and insufficient risk assessment, that's not. And so it's not surprising that if people are driven by external considerations that aren't member interests, things don't work. And I think most of the research literature, and I think virtually all these questions, in terms of the difference of opinion, can be interpreted that way. And so just focus on the returns debate. In 2015, there was a paper that cited over 2,000 studies. And academic studies, and I'm just focused on academic studies, have some deficiencies. They tend to focus on what's publicly available data. That means returns. That means that some things that investment managers have access to, they may not. But it tends to be relatively retrospective. There are issues of cause and effect. It may be that companies that are very effective are ones that do ESG things. But the literature overall, when you look at meta-studies, and there have been dozens of meta-studies, is that ESG investing does not have a return cost. In many cases, it outperforms. And there are various interpretations of it. One is the Benjamin Graham interpretation, the one I gave early on, that when the pension fund thinks about fundamentals, because it's investing long-term, things tend to work. And Benjamin Graham's initial focus on cash flows, very, very important, was interesting, but if Benjamin Graham were writing today, he'd say you need to look deeper behind the cash flows. You need to look at things like the things behind ESG factors. And when you do that, you invest more effectively. That means, of course, that these models can be very complicated. There are lots of governance costs, but it does mean that ESG investing potentially does not conflict fiduciary duties, but it's actually supporting it. That you almost have a fiduciary duty to take these interests into account because they're so important. There's a lot of evidence that intangibles, the things that are in some of these ESG ratings, are things that matter for companies. They're things that help grow, that help companies grow. How companies deal with their employees, their consumers, those are elements of future value. So there is some evidence that ESG investing does work. On the other hand, when you look back historically, if we were doing this conference 20 years ago, There was a lot of evidence that it didn't. There was a lot of evidence that funds that had political interference investing in things that looked like ESG investments but were driven by local interests didn't do well. I edit the Journal of Pension Economics and Finance for the last 20 years, Cambridge University Press, with Josh Rao at Stanford. He's done a lot of work in the US looking at politically driven investing and the value it destroys. Robert Palacios of the World Bank did a lot of work on this topic. Olivia Mitchell, who I also work with, has over time looked at, the literature in the US is complicated because the politically motivated investment as a share of total investment is so small it can be difficult to get signals out. But there is a lot of evidence that when things are politically motivated, they don't work well. And so when you look at these thousands of studies, essentially pension funds can get higher returns by investing sustainably if they think in terms of fundamentals. And similarly, if I go to one of the next questions, and I probably will not do all of them, I'll just mention briefly some of the issues. If you think about, does sustainable investing make a difference? Again, fundamentals is important. There are lots of papers looking at greenwashing, lots of papers looking at things that haven't been well defined. When funds pretend, and pension fund investors pretend to do things because they're forced for political reasons or they don't believe in them, it doesn't work. The impact is minor. When it's done from fundamentals, there are quite a few studies that indicate that that some of these things do work. It does have impact. Pension fund activism does work, but when it's driven by fundamentals, a desire to add value rather than political pressure. The evidence on whether or not these changes to more sustainable investing are driven by regulation or fundamentals is also mixed. Again, it'd be nice if this happened automatically, if somehow pension funds decided that it was the right thing to do to invest sustainably, that they thought through things and they focused on the real fundamental value. But of course, it's very hard to do these models. And instead of regulation driving things, I think what I draw from what I've read over time is that when the regulation is spurring more action, it's spurring more thinking, it tends to work. When the regulation is very prescriptive, it tends not to. And that's it's very difficult for me to back that up with specific research studies, but I think there's a broad sense here that if the emphasis is on fundamentals, you have value. Now, I'd like to spend, and I'm going through time pretty quickly, I'd like to spend some time talking about technology. And a lot of this is speculative, and I wrote down a lot of things from for and against these different topics that I went through. Does technology does technology empower pension funds to invest sustainably? And there are, of course, arguments for that it can reduce the confusion, the divergence of ESG ratings, it can sort things out, it can find opportunities. On the other hand, it can cause data overload, reliance on imperfect algorithms. It can do things that don't matter. And there are limitations of things like AI. I'd argue that we are dealing with a fundamentally, historically conservative industry. And that conservatism has benefited the industry. It's benefited the industry because it's meant that the pension funds weren't heavily invested in derivatives before the global financial crisis. It's benefited the industry because it's looked out for member interests over time, but it's been a bit conservative on adopting new technology. But sustainability really is about member interests and what members need, and people have different bequest motives, they have different time frames. Older members might not care as much about climate, it's too far in the future. And technology has this effect that it can democratize things. It can capture what member interests are and can reduce the degree of delegation. And so it has a lot of potential power. So of all the research questions, and I'm happy to talk to anyone about what the literature is and have a dialogue about it, but I think it comes down to motivations, which I don't think the academic literature is that good at teasing out. And so if the motivation when I read everything, it's difficult to prove some of this, but when I read the literature and think about it carefully, it's about what the motivation of the fund and how much they believe in these things. And so if we can have an environment where people think carefully and deeply about the future and have foresight and take into account different factors, geopolitical may matter more for some pension funds than climate. Some demographic factors matter. There are lots of things driving the future, and climate may be overemphasized. If we can get pension funds to think clearly about the future and all the different aspects of it, I think that's very good if they believe in this stuff. But if it's purely a box-ticking exercise, then I don't think the evidence is very strong that it's going to work very well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm going to hand straight over to Angela.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. As Brendan mentioned, I am presenting from the regulator's side, and to do so, I am going to briefly describe CAPSA's risk management guideline, today with a focus on the ESG provisions. So fair warning, if you were in the technical committee meeting earlier this week, some of this is going to sound very, very familiar, the beginning and the end, but I promise there's new content in the middle. So bear with me. Things in my hands up here. So to begin, I would like to give you a brief overview of CAPSA and its mission, just so that everyone has an idea of who we are. So CAPSA was established in 1971. It's officially older than I am. It's a national association of pension regulators from each Canadian province and the federal government. The Canada Revenue Agency and StatsCan are also associate members of CAPSA. Because pensions are provincially regulated in Canada, that means we have 10 pension regulators, not one, although you usually see me, there's 10 of us. So CAPS is a forum for the exchange and discussion where regulators work together to solve common problems and develop practical solutions to those problems. So CAPS's role is to promote the coordination and harmonization of regulatory principles and practices in pension supervision in order to promote an efficient and effective pension regulatory system in Canada. CAPSA develops policies and guidelines, such as the Risk Management Guideline, to improve the administration of pension plans and assist plan administrators in fulfilling their fiduciary duty, while strengthening the protection afforded to plan members. Every 3 years, CAPSA develops a strategic plan that lists the various priorities that serve as a framework for the initiatives and objectives on which we will focus over the 3-year period. Typically, a committee is established for each of those strategic initiatives, particularly if we plan on developing a guideline or best practices in that area. And committee members may also establish an industry working group to assist in the development of a guideline. So why was CAPSA concerned about the risk management of a pension plan? Well, at the end of the day, the primary purpose of a pension plan is to provide beneficiaries with pension benefits. In fulfilling the primary objective, the plan administrator or the trustees must act in accordance with their fiduciary duties and take into account the standard of care to which they're subject under our legislation. If the administrator is not aware of the risks associated with the plan, has no process to identify the risk factors or measures to mitigate those risks, then there's a greater likelihood that the plan's objectives will not be achieved and that the benefits of the beneficiaries in the plan will be affected. Therefore, good risk management is an essential feature of a well-managed plan and an important element in protecting members' benefits. So it's necessary for all pension plans, regardless of their type, whether it's defined benefit, defined contribution, or one of the various hybrid type plans, their size, or the level of assets in the plan, that the administrator adopt good risk management practices to meet its fiduciary obligations and the applicable standard of care. Oops, I seem to have skipped ahead one. That's all right. We can go there. So the main point for today's purposes, environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, is one of the special consideration topics within CAPSA's risk management guideline. Other special consideration topics include investment, leverage, cybersecurity, and use of third parties. So where did the need for CAPSA to include ESG within its risk management guideline come from? As the consideration of ESG factors in the investment decision-making process is increasingly viewed as an integral part of the trustee's fiduciary duty, CAPSA was concerned that some plans may not consider ESG factors due to the lack of guidance, lack of examples of best practices, or due to the perception that the impact of ESG is not necessarily financial. In developing the guidance, a survey was developed to be used for consultation with industry stakeholders. The survey included a preface noting the emergence of ESG considerations in investment decision-making and the debate surrounding whether the integration of environmental, social, and governance factors into the investment and risk management processes was aligned with the trustees' fiduciary duties, taking into consideration the purpose of the pension plan, which, as we mentioned, was to provide benefits in retirement. The guidance was drafted with key elements in mind, that it be a principles-based document, not prescriptive, that fiduciary duty be highlighted, and that the concept of proportionality be included. What are the main points then that emerged for ESG within the CAPSA risk management guideline? We want, considering the available information on ESG issues helps to have a holistic view of the plan's financial situation, a better overview, and a comprehensive understanding of the factors that may affect the value of the pension plan's assets and liabilities. It is not whether a plan invests in ESG funds or doesn't invest in ESG funds that fulfills that fiduciary duty. Rather, it's whether the consideration of ESG factors, whether the plan administrators considered ESG factors in their investment making decision process. So, because considering ESG factors provides insight into the potential opportunities and risks associated with various investments, and therefore allows for an assessment of the financial risk-return profile. CAPSA's ESG guidance, is principles-based, as I mentioned. Okay. Those principles include identification, assessment, and communication. It's essential for the administrator to be able to identify, understand, and assess ESG risks in the plan's investment risk profile. To do this, it can call on ESG rating agencies. ESG risks are said to be cross-cutting. They manifest themselves through other risks. I seem to have a faulty microphone. Some are also systemic. They cannot be. Thank you. Okay, we'll try this. Try this one? Or not? There we go. Some are systemic. They can't be avoided by diversification of the fund, such as climate change or ESG factors. To assist in investment decision-making, the administrator can develop an investment strategy that helps to understand and manage ESG exposures, prompts the administrator to be diligent in delegating and integrating ESG factors into the decision-making processes, and invites the administrator to justify whether or not ESG factors are selected in the investment choices available to participants. ESG assessments should be included in the plan's investment policy at the appropriate level. Finally, communication. We're in an era where transparency is increasingly important, not only for stakeholders and partners, but also and above all for pension plan members. They want to know what types of investments their assets are invested in. It is therefore very important to share information related to the consideration of ESG factors for governance, risk management, and investment purposes. The logical place to do this would be in the Statement of Investment Policies and Procedures, but it can also be on a plan's website or through other communications to members. The important thing is that the information is conveyed. So in keeping with CAPSA's role, CAPSA's members are engaged in the development of guidelines to assist administrators with their fiduciary duties and thus ultimately protect the rights and interests of plan members. But we are not a regulatory body. Rather, we're there to provide guidance and best practices. It's the individual regulators who are members of CAPSA who decide, following a guidelines publication, how they intend to implement and enforce that guideline. One of the main objectives when a guideline is published is to educate administrators so that they can ask themselves the right questions, do a self-assessment on how they manage the plan, but also to be able to ask right questions to the relevant parties around them. The guideline can therefore be used as a basis for initiating those discussions. As I said a couple of seconds ago, CAPSA is not a regulatory body. The guidelines represent only the views of the members and set out principled good practices. We always try to include a statement regarding proportionality that recognizes that although the guideline applies to all pension plans, not all pension plans will apply the guideline equally. They can tailor it to their size, their complexity, and other characteristics of the plan. With respect to the risk management guideline, however, as most Canadian jurisdictions have a requirement that pension plans already have a risk management framework in place, we have made the statement that it's expected that this guideline be implemented immediately throughout the country. So last but not least, some of the key aspects on CAPSA's approach are on the slide. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them, but I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure to be with you today, and I hope you found the information useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. Fiona, over to you.
I want to take a step back here, just so we're all on the same page, because there's so much alphabet soup in all of this. What do we mean by sustainable finance? To answer that question, I think you have to ask, what do we mean by sustainable development? I always go back to something called the Brandt Report, which was done for the UN back in the 1980s. This is the definition. Sustainable development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Listen to that definition. Future generations, current needs. That's a pension plan. This is why you as pension regulators should be looking at this topic, because it's all about intergeneration. I absolutely agree with you, Mike. Sustainable finance is then making sure that all our global financial architecture, our lendings, our savings, capital aligns with the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and the Paris Accord. And you can boil that down, you can boil the SDGs into the environment, so within planetary boundaries, so using the environmental resources that we have, not overusing them, and without excessive degrees of inequality. That's basically what the SDGs say. This has been around for a long time, as Mike said, very long time. What's different is that we've had that definition in the SDGs, and we have specific climate targets, scientific targets from the Paris Accord. That's what's different, and this is why the dialogue on sustainable finance has changed in recent years. I also think it's really important to make a distinction, I'm going to quote from my UK colleagues, between, you've probably heard this adage, of greening finance and financing green. And I think a lot of confusion comes because we mix up the risk with the opportunity and the impact. So the greening finance means that we need to make sure that all of our investments, our lending, etc., is in line with that development goals, is not disaligned, is not taking us off into the wrong direction that will not meet those goals. And the financing green is making sure as much of the capital as we can is going towards the sort of investments that we need to make to globally and collectively meet the SDGs. Right now, it's not. It's not. Money is not flowing to where we need that investments to go. So much of the, many of my colleagues at this part of the room, hello, Mozambique, etc., you guys know some of the most vulnerable countries that need the adaptation of the finance. You're not getting the finance you need to get there. 16% of climate, there's already a huge climate finance gap, 16% is going to the emerging markets ex-China, even though they have more than 25% of GDP. And only about 5% of climate finance is going to adaptation and resilience. So it's not getting there to where we need it at the moment. So, what are we doing? In terms of the greening finance, so I think we're actually a really interesting point, Angie, at the moment in terms of regulation. I actually think we're at a regulatory tipping point. Much of this to date has been voluntary initiatives. Lots of voluntary, the UNPRI, and lots of collective investor, corporate governance groups. It's now tipping into regulation, and Mike's absolutely right. We've got to get it right. We must make sure that this is harmonized and that we don't have unintended consequences. So, just to give you one, we've done a lot of work on ESG and sovereign bonds. And you would think if you put an ESG tilt onto sovereign bond index, that would take money to where it needs to go for the Sustainable Development Goals. It doesn't, because the indicators for the SDGs are very related to GDP. You end up with an unintended income bias that pushes funds back to Canada or Finland, or it's not necessarily going to where the money needs it most. There are a lot of unintended consequences. Thinking about this regulation, I think, is really important going forward. And I think you, as the pension regulators, are going to be asked these hard questions. I mean, 2100 is not theoretical date for your members. If you join a pension fund today at 20, your pension's paying out in 2100. This is not a theoretical model for what the climate's going to be looking like in 2100. If I was joining a pension fund today, I would be asking you guys some really hard questions about this intergenerational stuff. So increasingly, I think the pension regulators are going to be pulled into this dialogue asking pension funds as the asset owners, what is your GHG footprint? What is your net zero target for your portfolio? How are you going to get there? What's your transition plan? And you will then drive the asset managers who drive the corporations, who drive the ultimate capital flows. So I really think we're at this really interesting tipping point for greening finance, and you have a really key role to play. On the financing green, so that's kind of where we come in with the MDBs, and there's a lot of pressure on the development banks. I just came from COP in Baku last week. And yes, we're doing a lot at the bank. We need to use our balance sheet better. We're tiny. We're small. Compared to your 50 trillion of assets, we have about 70 billion a year. We're very small, the development banks. We need to sweat our balance sheets better. Absolutely. We need to use the precious concessional finance that we have to work with you to really make this blended finance story work better. So one thing we do is we issue bonds. We're a bank. All of our bonds, all the bank bonds, we say are sustainable because that's our ultimate DNA. We invest in those projects. We're trying to do more innovative instruments like, you probably know, as South Africans probably know our rhino bonds. Everyone loves the rhino bonds that we did, which actually has a payout that depends on the increase in rhino conservation species in parks in South Africa. We're doing one here with our Indonesian colleagues. We're working on a coral bond for the marine protected areas that pays out if you can get fish species protected. So these sort of outcomes that really incentivize, it pays a return, it's a very secure asset, Mike, but you can also have some measurable impact from them. So these are sort of interesting instruments we're trying to develop. 2 is the guarantees. So exactly as you say, Mike, we need to be paying the pensions, we need the fundamentals, you need the returns. This is where we come in to make sure that the projects that we need to make the SDGs can give you the returns you need. You mentioned solar parks. Biggest solar park in the African region is in Egypt. We actually worked on a bond. The solar park itself issued a project bond. It was guaranteed by MEGA, a guarantee authority, and the EBRD, and the pension funds around the world bought that bond. So we need to use guarantees as well as really, again, sweat our balance sheet, use our balance sheet. And finally, the other thing I think is really interesting, and you may have views on this, I think, actually, because Canada's very good, co-investment, which some of your Canadian pension funds have been absolutely leading in this, and it links back to the infrastructure discussion we had yesterday. How we get pension funds to work together, the bigger ones, the smaller ones, some that have experience of solar investments, of infrastructure, Others don't. How do we put them together to get the sort of scale and experience that you have with the Canadian funds? And your Canadian funds have been very good at this, about working with the Singapore fund, with the EPF in Malaysia, etc. We've been working, Kenya, I think our Kenyans are here. We've been working with some of the pension funds in Kenya, for example, have set up a co-investment group called KEPFIC, the Kenyan Pension Fund Consortium, to come together to invest in infrastructure, to share their knowledge and to share the burden of that. The Australian funds have owned an asset manager for many years. I think some of these co-investment trends for pension funds is another way to get the scale, to get the voice, to get the investments at the right risk and return they need, to get the capital flowing to where we need it to meet the SDGs and the Paris Accords. So that's some of the trends, but I would urge you to think carefully about thinking about the risk versus the return and unpicking some of this ESG soup. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Elvin, over to you.
Hello. Pak Ogi yang terhormat, tuan-tuan dan puan-puan, YC, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. First of all, I really want to express my gratitude because I'm really honored to be invited to be here today to join all the distinguished speakers and all the representatives of IOPS to share some findings and viewpoints. As Mike and Brendan had mentioned, my role today here is to sort of share the voice of customers. And before I do that, allow me to just briefly introduce myself and Manulife, which is where we represent our customers where we operate. So Manulife is a Canadian-based financial company that has insurance and asset management background, but it is one of also the few companies that are very focused on retirement pension business. We have our own global line of business in retirement, which I'm from. I'm part of the Asia retirement team. And we are also very proud to be serving and helping savers, over 9 million savers globally, of which 3 million of those are in Asia, where we are, and 2.3 million of those in Hong Kong, as well as over 700,000 in Indonesia. So before I get into my slide, since it's just after the lunchtime, I want to get some feedback and maybe just be a bit interactive. And also apologize in advance if my comments come across as controversial, but they represent what we see on the ground from, again, interacting and engaging with our customers. So first, I view, well, sustainable finance, we generally simply call it ESG, rightly or wrongly. So I view ESG, the adoption of ESG, is somewhat similar to whether you have access to Wi-Fi. And why do I say that? So let me first share my observations from yesterday and today. So I was paying close attention to the speakers, and I was looking through all the decks and the material, trying to find how many times ESG is being mentioned before our session. Does anybody have any recollection? Actually, I'm very surprised. I could be wrong, according to my unofficial data collection. I've only seen it once this morning in India's deck with the term ESG, and I've barely heard anyone raising it. So this goes back to my earlier comment. Adoption of ESG, I say it's like access to Wi-Fi. Why? Because in some way, this is the controversial part, in some way, this is the rich man's problem, the first world problem. Over the past 2 days, I have heard so much and learned so much from all the different distinguished speakers and through the conversations. We've heard about the systems, right, the different three-pillar systems. There's a lot of challenges in getting people to contribute in terms of coverage. And we also get into talk about investments, capabilities, and capital markets and whatnot. Again, I'm quite surprised, and as I was telling YC, our regulator from Hong Kong as well, if this conference were in Hong Kong, we would have heard it many, many times, 20, 50 times, as Fiona had alluded to. But again, we have not heard that. And I think part of the problem is, again, we are dealing with other bigger problems. Not that ESG is not important, but there are bigger, important issues to be addressed in many of the markets that we are present. I have prepared a few slides today, but I don't plan to go through all of them. Again, I think we all agree we want to leave time for more interactions and questions and answers. So, a rich man's problem. So especially from the perspective of Asia, I think from our experience, European pension funds typically are the ones that are leading in terms of ESG adoption. They are the region that has looked into this issue, and they have done most of the research, and a lot of the European pension funds are very, very focused on sustainable and ESG. We do see there's quite a bit of adoption coming from North America. We heard from Canada. And we've also seen a lot of noises in the market in the past 12 to 18 months in the US. There's been a lot of backlashes due to issues related to greenwashing. So at one point, we were thinking, well, the US firms, the European firms that are based in Hong Kong, in Asia, they're pushing really hard on ESG. But now we do see some of the North American firms shying away from using that term too often. Across Asia, as I mentioned, ESG adoption is gradually growing, but still not anywhere close to Europe or North America. Some of the countries who do a bit better are like Japan. China has been pushing hard. And I'm going to go into an example from Hong Kong. So in my opinion, the MPF system of Hong Kong has done a really good job. And I don't say it just because YC and the team is sitting in a room, but it is truly it is very important. Just as I mentioned, and I think Fiona was mentioning that sustainable finance, ESG, it's voluntary. It's not mandatory to date. So when it's not mandatory, oftentimes there are more important and bigger issues to cater to. So I think where the MPFA has done a really good job on this is back in 2021, the MPFA has launched the principles for adopting sustainable investing in the investments and risk management process of MPF funds. Now that covers 4 key elements, including governance, strategy, risk management, and disclosure. I'm not going to go into each and every one of the principles, but in short, the MPF trustees and its boards of directors are tasked to ensure that proper ESG integration has been taken into consideration in the setting up of its investment process, risk management process, and in terms of the funds that are being offered. And more importantly is that proper disclosure has to be made in order for the investors to be aware of what they're investing into. As a result of the launch of this principle back in 2021, the industry players have come together to support this initiative. As you can see, the table to the right, the 4 funds at the bottom, those were all launched in 2023. Look at the square, in the parentheses. Some of the 3 funds in the middle, they were launched earlier, but they were converted into ESG funds. So there are 4 ESG funds that have been launched in the MPF platform. To put things into perspective, there are a total of 374 funds across 12 different trustees and over 20 schemes. So 374 funds. And here we are, we've seen 4 funds that are being converted or launched just over the past year in 2023 that are very focused on ESG. That's roughly 1%. Is that enough? Maybe not. But ESG is not just about converting and making every single fund to be called ESG fund. I think more importantly is what I've mentioned earlier about ensuring the integration of ESG factors and principles into the management of the pension funds, again, including the investments, risk management, etc. And I think I'm proud, and I think MPFA will be even prouder to say that because of the adoption of the principles, over 90% of the assets in MPF today have taken into account ESG considerations. And for the remaining 10%, it's not that they don't do it, because most of the assets are the ETF index tracking, so they're less discretionary from the manager's perspective to actively choose ESG or non-ESG factors. So I think, again, ESG is not just about launching ESG-specific funds. I think one of the more important, as we continue to emerge through the journey of ESG, is raising the awareness. And while understanding that many countries have bigger issues to deal with, it's never too late to also factor in some ESG factors as we continue to implement new pension pillars, looking at contributions and looking at coverage issues. I conclude my prepared slides remarks here and open to more Q&A questions with the rest of the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all 4 speakers. A lot to think about. Okay, we've plenty of time to throw this open to the floor, whether you want to ask questions or you want to make your own contributions. Either way, you'd be very welcome. So who would like to start off? Down there, bottom left. And if all contributors could identify themselves, it would also be useful.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for your insightful presentations and comments. Just two questions from my side. So, in South Africa, we've already, since 2011, had in our regulations that when funds make investments, you must consider ESG factors when making those investments. The challenge that I think that we face is that, of course, funds also want alpha for their clients. And it is seen as if there's a tension between obtaining alpha and investing in ESG. So I just wanted to ask the panel, and anyone is welcome to answer, how best to resolve that issue. I know a couple of years ago, or as far as I'm aware, there was a McKinsey report which actually showed that it really made even commercial sense to invest in ESG. But of course, there are other reports and other, information that contradicts that. So if you could just clarify that, because I think that would go a long way to assuaging concerns around ESG. Then another question I wanted to ask was, so at a geopolitical level, if you now look at the US, for example, with President Trump, who doesn't seem to really believe in climate change, or at least that was, what he articulated previously. Do you see that would have any impact on investments in ESG for the US, and that may have a ripple effect? Yeah, so thanks. I think that's from my side.
Thank you. 2 tough questions to start. Anybody want to?
I think you need to be very clear on what you're looking at in terms of risk and what you're looking in terms of impact or return. And so, as you say, South Africa, you've been global leaders in corporate governance with the King Report. You've led this for many, many years, This is a material risk. We are increasingly getting the evidence that shows that these are material risks to investments. So it's part of a fiduciary duty of a fund to say, if I'm investing in infrastructure, is this going to be resilient going forward in future? If you're investing heavily in fossil fuels, what is the transition risk of this being a stranded asset? This is not about taking a lower return. This is really asking hard questions about the long-term risk of your portfolio. Now, there may also then be products, and I think we need to be very clear, we're just talking about the labeling of these different products. And before, there has been a lot of greenwashing and labels. We're getting much more tighter on what are the definitions of these funds. If you call something an ESG fund in the UK or in Europe now, there is much tighter definitions of what that means. So it has to be 70, 80% of the fund has to be aligned either with your taxonomy of what's green or with the objectives of the fund. There might be some exclusions as well, etc. So we're getting much tighter definitions about what you're actually investing in actually on that side as well. And I also think we need to be very clear on the difference between a rating and a ranking. And I think these things get very mixed up as well. An ESG rating, in a credit rating, has a very, very specific purpose, looking at the probability of default over a certain period of time. ESG rankings, so some of these funds or indexes that have a tilt, they have to be very clear. We might tilt towards low carbon. We might have a tilt towards gender. We might have a tilt. That's then an investment choice for members. So I think you need to be very clear on whether you're looking at this in terms of return. I think you need to be very clear on what the label of the product says. And I think you need to be very clear that the members then understand what they are investing in, if there are additional objectives on top of the return, as Mike says, on the fundamentals. You may want to achieve a specific objective as well, and that's where the labeling and definitions come in too. I think that's a better way of looking at it than getting tangled up in this. Does ESG add return? Is it higher? Is it lower? Or whatever. And as Mike says, there's millions of reports out there and studies out there. But I would think very carefully, look at the risk and then define the impact.
I just want to jump in. I thought that was an excellent question. Thank you very much. There's an extra factor here that I didn't raise. I sort of alluded to at the end. And that's the issue of elites making these decisions. And if you think about what's happened in the US politically, okay, a little closer to it. If you think what's happened in the US, technology can solve some of these problems, and if it's perceived to be the case that it's elites making decisions, fund managers or others that aren't necessarily doing what the members want, it becomes a big issue. And so this thing about focus on climate as opposed to fundamentals more broadly is an issue. And it probably is going to, what's happened in the US may lead to some democratization, and it's not a bad thing. The other point I'd raise is, and again, this is something that in terms of the research literature, what it shows, is that I referred to a study of more than 2,000 empirical studies on ESG and financial performance, Freed, Bush, and Boston from 2015. When I reread that paper recently, it showed the biggest difference in terms of ESG outperforming was actually in emerging markets. There's a perception, that ESG investing is only for the elite countries, the elite people, and I'm not sure that's the case. You have to think about why ESG investing might work, fundamentals. The things that you have in developed markets, relatively deep understanding of what's happening, things priced in with markets, a degree of maturity, you don't necessarily have in emerging markets. There's more intangibles that matter a lot. There's more growth in the future, so these factors connected with soft factors matter a lot too. You also have market signals that don't work as well. So I'd actually argue, and this is sort of a counter argument to what was said earlier about there is definitely perception that ESG investing is for rich countries and decisions are made by elites. But I'd actually argue that the need to focus on fundamentals is probably more important for both regulators and for the pension fund representatives in developing markets than it is in developed.
Thank you, Mike. Can I remind you all that you can use Slido if you prefer to use it rather than asking a question directly. And speaking of Slido, a question for Angela. Do you have any assessment of the impact of the CAPSA guidance?
Thanks. Unfortunately, no, mainly because our guidance really was just released in September of 24. I don't know if this is on or not. I can't tell. My voice sounds loud, but I'm not sure if that's just because I'm, I'm up here. But so hopefully you can hear me. Our guidelines came out in September of 2024. I will say, from a regulatory perspective, Canada's a bit behind some of the European countries as far as recognizing ESG. I mean, I know some of our pension plans are very, very large, and they are a bit ahead of perhaps where the regulators were, but really it's a fairly new item that the regulators have turned their attention to. Certainly Europe has been far more involved in it for far longer than we have. So at this point, we're still, I think, working out how exactly we would assess the various plans against the guidelines and how we're even, each regulator is going to choose to implement them.
Thank you. Next question from the floor. Well, while you're working up to that, let me ask a few questions. Maybe, Alvin, a question for you, I think, but I'd welcome other people's contributions. One way of looking at ESG is you can break the, let me call it the decision into, I suppose, whether or not to take explicit account of ESG issues, the model you're going to use to do that if you decide to, and then gathering the data or the information needed to make that decision. And it strikes me, especially for smaller pension funds, that last step is an enormous challenge. And I'd be interested in your perspective, and indeed any other people on the panel.
Yeah, so some of the challenges of introducing ESG or adopting ESG exactly is the definition and the data. When we talk about credit ratings, it's fairly straightforward. You have the few companies that do it. The methodologies are very consistent. You typically rely on one of the three rating agencies for the similar ratings, 2 of 3, 3 of 3, depending on how you like to adopt it. So those are fairly straightforward. But when it comes to ESG, the amount of variances in the universe or the data sets in terms of where you can get them, the different types of ratings, and there's just too many to choose from. And it makes it very hard for pension funds. So we are the trustee, for example, in Hong Kong, we're the trustee of the MPF scheme. So we also have fiduciary responsibilities to do or write on the regulations of the MPFA, to do more on ESG, and we would like to lead. But we continue again to face these difficult challenges as there's no one set of consistent way to do it, right? Sometimes we just say, why don't you tell me how I need to do it, and we can then try to implement it. So I think this is where we continue to face a lot of the challenges. And I think from a market perspective, we still don't hear too much from our customers, the end customers, the investors, the participants, demanding for ESG product. So the 4 funds that I've mentioned just now that converted or launched in the recent past years, 2 of those were actually done by Manulife, Has that helped us to win more customers and gain more new cash flows? The frank answer is it hasn't. But we went ahead and do it again because we feel that it is our responsibility. It is a way to get to the market, to get people to be aware. So I think raising the awareness, as I mentioned earlier, is very important at this stage for ESG, especially in Asia. But we too could use guidance or help in terms of implementing ESG in the pension plans.
Thank you. I must say, as a regulator, one of the things I am aware of is that it can be a lot easier to make regulations than it can be to fulfill them. And particularly, well, not unique to ESG, but it's certainly a good example of the fact that of an instance where the regulations can become very, what's the word? The word escapes me, but we're trying to achieve high goals with the regulations, and we haven't necessarily worked out how those to whom the regulations apply are going to fulfil them. Now, if you get that difference exactly right, if the gap isn't too big, the regulation can drive developments. People will find a way. But if the gap is too big, it just becomes you end up undermining pension funds. Yeah.
So I'm going to deliberately push back a little bit, because I think there actually is quite a lot of guidance out there, and I think it's becoming clearer by the day. Now, there were lots and lots of different approaches previously when this was a voluntary. So absolutely, anyone could decide this is an ESG fund, this is a green fund, this is what. There was no definition before. You could come up with it. I think that's changing very quickly. Because we're getting these taxonomies around the world, we're getting stronger, clearer definitions of what is green. We're getting labeled for financial products which align with those taxonomies that are coming out around the world. We're getting guidance on transition plans for companies at a portfolio level, at a national level actually. In COP last week, loads of talk about what makes a good transition plan. I actually think there's a lot of, but how do you measure GHG for a portfolio? PACTA, it's not perfect, but actually we have proxies and models for how you measure the footprint of financed emissions out of a portfolio. None of this is perfect, it's all developing, but I actually think there is increasingly a standardized set of tools which is coming together globally as we tip from voluntary into regulatory, as we tip into these standards that are becoming more clear. I actually think there is quite a lot of guidance that's coming out there together. So I'm actually quite hopeful that it's not perfect, we need more underlying data, we're not there yet, but I actually see a lot more guidance and a lot more standardization and harmonization starting to come.
I'd like to just jump in there really quickly, because I thought Brendan raised a really, really interesting point. And I think we need to think carefully about what's missing in terms of the authority of the regulators and supervisors to look into some of this stuff. So if the world is changing where ESG issues, maybe not ratings, maybe not the current name, maybe not even sustainability, become more important because of the increasing complexity of the world and changes that are occurring that are, you have technological change, you have geographic change, including climate, you have demographic change that makes the job of investing a lot harder, and the reliance of pension funds on things like ESG ratings that much more important. But are the regulators and supervisors able to look at these ratings? Are they able to audit them? Do they know they're fit for purpose? Do they have the expertise to do that? And so I think there's going to be a change in, as pension funds consolidate and become larger and the smaller funds attract less attention, I think the scope of supervision is going to inevitably expand in scope to looking at some of these instruments and whether they're fit for purpose, because it's just a little bit off to me, is that if it's a requirement that a pension fund looks at this stuff, but you have no way of evaluating how good it is and whether it's fit for purpose, it is a bit of a problem.
Just behind you.
Thomas Lariza, Croatian Financial Services Supervisory Agency. I have a question which is maybe also a comment, but somehow listening at a discussion, I have a feeling that, you know, we are getting like cold feet with this ESG stuff. You know, a couple of years ago it was very trendy, everybody wanted to be in there and so on and so forth. Now we only see troubles and problems, how to do it and so on. So my question is, I mean, is this in a way similar to, let's say, child labor or let's say slave labor? I mean, we as a society have decided that this is not good, you know. We're not going to have it, you know. And then we just switched, you know, to not having it, you know. And now we think, I mean, with ESG, is a problem there with that we do not believe that climate change is happening, or what, you know? So I would like to hear your perspective on that. Thanks.
So I think because this has been voluntary and there's been all these different initiatives, I think there's been a lot of confusion. I think you've had some, if you want to call it backlash, the US aside, there's been a little bit of sort of concerns about greenwashing, what are these definitions, etc. I don't think it's going away. I think we're getting more clarity. And exactly as you say, we've had, as you say, we've had labour standards for many years. We've had environmental and social safeguards within our projects at the World Bank for decades. We have some of the basics of this in place. What we're doing is now taking these definitions, making them clearer and hardwiring it into regulation. So I actually don't think it's going backwards. I actually think it's going to be more regulated, but with more clarity and with more guidance going forward. But I think that's it's because we've had a little bit of this 1,000 flowers blooming globally that's caused some confusion, but I actually don't think it's going away. I actually think it's going to be more regulated and more clarified.
Darius from the Secretariat. I have a question because while preparing this session also, we had a conversation about ESG things and how the members of pension funds perceive the ESG matters. And in some countries, they can take decisions themselves. So they can choose the asset allocation. And it can be the case that the perception is that, okay, that's something that is good, but I will not do that because I don't want to sacrifice my investment returns. Whether it's true or not, that's another story. Mike was saying it's not. My point is whether there is any space for the regulator, maybe not to push, but at least educate. What is your standpoint on that? Thank you.
I'm not sure I 100% understood the question, but I think there is, summarizing it a bit, you were asking whether you think there's space for the regulator to push on ensuring that the trustees or the plan administrators are taking ESG into consideration in their investment. And I think that's, at least from the Canadian perspective, I think that's exactly the tack that we did take, that it was very much an education document, that we wanted the plan trustees to make sure that they were at least considering what the impact of ESG factors could be on the risk factors within their investment portfolio. And some of those risks might be positive and some might be negative. And we're not saying they have to invest in ESG, but we are saying they have to consider it, and that in order to fulfill their fiduciary duties, they do have to have that analysis, I suppose, at the investment table. I had one question actually for Fiona. When you were mentioning that you think it'll be more regulated or should be more regulated, so that there's some type of assessment on these funds that are out there. Do you think that's a pension regulator, or do you think that's the securities regulators that are going to look at that?
I think it'll be both. I think it's both. Now, as you say, if the pensions are asking the question to the corporates they're investing in and they don't have the data, then it's going to be empty reporting, if you like. But I think that push to the securities regulator, and they are starting to mandate the ISSB, these international standards for reporting, is coming. So I think it's going to be from both sides. But yeah, but I think it's so, if you break it down, Darius, so I think it is part of it's increasingly the regulators are asking for ESG, and this is part of the risk assessment of a pension fund. The second thing that's happening, they're starting to ask to report. They're starting to ask for what is, you know, what is your carbon footprint? That's, I think, the next piece. And that's, I think, slightly separate, as I say, from the voluntary choice of a fund. So I'm the staff representative on the World Bank Pension Fund. And we have one of the options that we have is a low carbon option for investment, which I personally invest in because I believe the markets are not factoring in the transition risk of fossil fuel. I think it's being completely underestimated. So I am actively chosen to invest in a lower carbon portfolio than a market. So I think there's different pieces. There's the risk piece, there's the starting to push through reporting on it, and I think then there's the offering voluntary choices.
I want to jump in on Darius's question. I thought it was fascinating because it hits two elephants in the room that for 20 years or more, the regulatory community, the pension fund industry, the academic communities failed to deal with. The first elephant is that financial services firms tend to regard pension funds as a source of profits. There's always a savings gap, and it's a big marketing thing, and financial education is a marketing exercise to get more money in the door. And so if you think about the financial education exercises, they're really, you need to save more. They're not that effective at getting people to understand more, and some of the stuff Darius was mentioning is really hard to understand. That's elephant number one. Hasn't been dealt with effectively. Lots of financial planning models out there, they don't work very well because they're agency issues. The second thing going on here is governments think of pension funds as a huge source of money for their projects and for climate change and all these other things. And they're not necessarily aligned to that either. And some of these things aren't aligned to best member interests. So you have two elephants in the room, both that are intersecting in Darius's question. So it's very interesting. It's extraordinarily difficult to deal with. We have to actually wrestle with two things simultaneously that the industry and the supervisory authority and actually the academic community has just failed to deal with for a very, very long time. There are lots of issues here.
Darius, did you want to come back in there?
If I may, sorry, Darius, go ahead. So if I may jump in to share some perspective from sort of the consumer, again, perspective. So in terms of ESG adoption, there is a cost to it. There is a cost to it, just as there is cost to increase tax incentives to increase contributions, just as there's cost to, increase contributions and so on and whatnot. So there is a cost to ESG disclosure and compliance and everything to it. So when it comes to prioritizing where to spend and what the costs are, right? So as a pension plan, we need to be able to prioritize. Do I want to spend more time enhancing digital capabilities to be able to help my pensioners, be more efficiently at managing their own portfolio? Do I want to spend in terms of extending to the outreach where my pension savers could be widespread, especially, for example, in the country of Indonesia, where people may not be all living in the city? Or do I want to spend more effort in education or ESG, right? So I think there's a practical element of cost of compliance, of cost of adoption that we also need to consider.
I just want to add my own comment about financial education. There are, I think, good examples out there of countries where financial education has been successfully done, but there are very, very few. And financial education is very difficult and very slow. So I don't think we can, to any extent, be it with relation to ESG or any other aspect of retirement savings, I think we always have to see financial education as a long-term supplementary play. You're not going to achieve fundamental change that relies solely on financial education, which isn't to argue against financial education, but just to be aware of the challenge and the limitations. Okay, Ambrosio.
First of all, thank you very much for this discussion.
Thank you very much for this discussion that is very intense, and I would say it's intense and interesting because not all points of view actually are compatible one with the other. That is my feeling. And in particular, I see some tension between the major statements that Mike was doing when you say, and I agree with that, that the world is becoming and is being perceived, I would say, more complex than it used to be, or it used to be perceived somehow. And Fiona, I would say, that Fiona is on the side of being more optimistic, saying that at least in terms of sustainability, we are going in the right direction. There is more clarity about what is sustainable and what is not, what is aligned with sustainability and what is not. But these two things do not really go very well together, because actually my impression is that when you have complexity, you have also uncertainty on what could be the major factors, the main factors, or the factors that have most impact on the future in the very long term. And I would even say that some disagreement, or some, I would say, difference of opinions on what is sustainable or what is most important to target as the objective would be even useful in terms of getting things right, because I would somehow be worried if we are all forced to agree on the exact direction in which we want to go, because things are more difficult. And I would say the functioning of the markets, of the market discovery for financial investment, for long-term financial investments, actually do work on some disagreement about what is considered to be appropriate or more profitable or more adapt to, just one sec, Fiona, in the long term. So I would say what we all agree on is the approach of the Canadian authorities, because pension supervisors, because actually it's obvious that in terms of fiduciary duty, you have to consider risk, ESG risks, because they have anyway, they have big impact. But the problem is whether you, as a fiduciary, in application to the fiduciary duty, you also would allow to sacrifice some return, because you, in order to represent the interest of members, you want to go in specific directions. And I would say that is also possible, and that is also fair. And the link with what I was saying before, that we have complexity and possibly difference of opinion, even in terms of values. We don't, not all the world agrees about values. There are, I don't know, just think about religions and values that are brought by different approaches to religion and to values. And I think we should recognize that some difference is actually physiological, I would say. But what probably we should also consider is that it is also, if somebody wants to achieve some specific objective in terms, for instance, of social values, there is a role of the governments and of people to push in different directions. So, for instance, I would say a pension fund could have an investment option that goes more in one direction, and an investment option that goes in another direction. That could be a possibility. But let me stop here because...
Just to respond, so I'm not saying there's no uncertainty on budget. What I think, to use the adage, I think we're moving from a world of unknown unknowns to known unknowns, to use the adage. Before, we didn't even know that climate was a risk. Nobody had heard of the concept of natural capital 5 years ago. We now know these are material risks to our economy and to our investments. Now, do we know the scale of it? Do we know when they're going to hit? Do we know how they're going to hit? No, we don't exactly. But I think we do have a clearer idea of what the risks that we should be looking at are. And I think through the SDGs and through the Paris Accord, we do now have much more of a global consensus on what some of these outcomes are. Not exactly, and you may want to, as I say, some people might want a product with gender, some might want with animals and nature, whatever. But I do think what's changed and why we're moving from the voluntary to the mandatory is because we do actually now have a much more of a global consensus with 100x whatever countries around the SDGs and 100x whatever countries on the Paris Accord. So I think we're moving from unknowns to known unknowns. I'm not saying there's no uncertainty. I'm not saying we have all the answers, but I do think we are coalescing around where we need to go.
Last comment question here.
Thank you, all the panelists. Abdullah from Maldives. Right. I'd like to, add to Fiona's point that I think ISSB has issued in June 2023 IFRS S1, S2, and CMDA, our Capital Market Development Authority, as a securities regulator, we are mandated to follow IOSCO because IOSCO has endorsed IFRS S1, S2. And my question is, because we are talking about, single materiality versus double materiality, and also the fact that we don't have much detail in IFRS standards in terms of metrics, how are we going to, adopt these in future and change in terms of, harmonizing or, having a convergent approach to this?
We're flashing red, so I can take that one offline. If you like.
I think just very briefly, because it seems like we're out of time. It's not unrelated to the points that Brajo Rinaldi was making, that making sense of the complex future and visualizing all the things that can happen is a wicked problem. We've not worked it out. And that's why financial education is difficult. It's why a lot of these things are difficult. And there are going to be natural disagreements, and they need to be factored in. We do not know where the world is going, and it'd be nice to see more research in the area. It'd be nice to see, once you can get people to understand the range of outcomes and scenarios and uncertainty, and maybe generative AI, maybe other technologies can help with it. But it's a wicked problem, and that wicked problem is we've not made much progress on in the last 20, 25 years. It's a little bit troubling.
Unfortunately and reluctantly, we're going to have to end it there. I think I could summarize the last hour and a half by saying this is really hard, and if there's a lesson to take home and think about. Can I thank on your behalf our 4 panelists who've been giving us very interesting presentations and very good responses to your questions. And thank you all for participating.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brendan Cannaby, to be the moderator. Amazing session we have with the speakers. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, can we give a big round of applause to the moderator and also the speakers? That was a very interesting session that we have together. That was an insightful presentation from each speaker. Thank you so much once again. And gentle reminder, ladies and gentlemen, about the survey. We will show you again on screen about the barcode. You may please scanning the barcode and fill the survey because your response means a lot to us. And for now, we will give you about 30 minutes coffee break before we are heading to the next panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, kindly inform you about the rest of agenda on the second day of conference. We have last panel discussion after the coffee break, and we still have 2 closing remarks to officially close the event. So now I would like to remind you once again to please enjoy the coffee break, and we will continue our next panel discussion at 3:30 p.m. Bali time. Thank you.